All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to get started with JavaScript. We're going to get you set up to be able to actually start running some JavaScript code and see how to get that integrated into the browser. All right, so the first thing to note about JavaScript is that JavaScript and Java are different languages. They are not the same thing. So while you might be used to working with Java and think JavaScript will be really similar, it's not. It'll share some similarities in syntax, but it's really not the same thing. They actually have no relationship to each other at all. The only relationship between Java and JavaScript is the same as between the Transformers movie and the Transmorphers movie. Literally, JavaScript was named as such to try to trick people into using it. When JavaScript first came out, Java was a really popular language, and so they named it JavaScript, hoping that people would pick up and start using JavaScript by mistake, thinking that it was the popular Java language. So it's literally a marketing ploy. It's the only relationship between those names. They are totally separate languages otherwise. So let's go ahead. First thing we do with any programming language is we're going to write our hello world. We're going to want to be able to say, let's get some code running so we can be able to see what it looks like. So we're going to write JavaScript code in JavaScript files, which will be files ending in .js extensions usually. Often we'll call these script.js, index.js, app.js. There's lots and lots of different things we can name them. So in our example here, what we're working with is we're going to be working in a file called index.js. We're going to often call our initial JavaScript files index.js the same way that we called our initial HTML files index.html, because this is the JavaScript file that's going to be associated with that HTML file. That's not built in. That's just sort of a way of helping us understand the naming conventions. So we can begin writing some code. I said the code is going to look somewhat similar to Java. So in this case, our hello world line of code is going to be console.log hello world. So console.log is a function similar to the system.out.println function, right? Same kind of thing with the dots in the middle, similar to the print function in R and Python. We're going to print out the string hello world. Again, quote strings. These should be concepts that you're familiar with. That shouldn't look too differently. We'll end with a semicolon, like Java ends with a semicolon. So that's our first line of code, right? That's going to print out the content hello world for us to be able to see. I'll note that we use Java or R style comments. No, sorry, Java style comments, not R, in JavaScript. So we're going to use slash and stars for able to do block style comments, and you can use double slashes for inline comments. So we can go ahead and do that. We're going to make sure to save our work. And now we've written some code. We've got hello world JavaScript. If we then go to our browser, to our web page, right? So this is our index.html file that we've loaded sort of inside the same inside the same structure, right? I've got my index.html next to my index.js file. If we refresh this page, you'll notice that we're still not seeing any console log, right? We're not seeing the hello world output that we said we wanted to type. This is because while we've written some code in JavaScript, we actually have to connect that JavaScript code to our HTML. So we're going to do that by including the JavaScript script file conceptually in the same way that we included CSS files, right? When we want to include a CSS file in HTML, we had to include a link element. When we're including JavaScript, we're going to include a script element. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a script element, and I'll just, here, actually, I'll write out directly. So in our HTML, we're going to write ourselves a script element. It's going to look like script. It has a closing tag with no actual content in the middle of it. So we have sort of open script, close script. And then our script tag will contain a source attribute, not an href attribute like links use. It'll use a source attribute like hyperlinks use, that will be then the relative path to that JavaScript file we wish to execute. So in this case, because my JavaScript file is inside JS, index.js, I would say start from HTML, go into the JS folder, and then go to the index.js file. And that's where we're then going to run the script. We can put the script tag in one of two different places in the HTML. We can include it inside the head, up where our links, our CSS links are, and that'll then cause that script to load sort of when the page first initializes, right? When we start loading in the JavaScript, it'll load that script. What will then happen, though, is if that script is then trying to modify or manipulate the HTML content that's on the page, if we say start messing with the HTML before we've actually gotten to the HTML, that can cause issues where the script won't be able to actually work correctly because the content it wants to be modifying or interacting with isn't there yet. So the other place that we'll tend to put the script tag is at the very bottom of the body, sort of the last thing on the page. It goes inside the body. It has to be rendered. It's rendered content, but we sort of put it after all the HTML content is loaded. In effect, these end up working about the same way. There's not too much of a difference. There's a couple of bugs that show up if you put things in the head and you haven't sort of adjusted your variables or timing correctly. So I tend to recommend in this class that we put all of our script tags at the bottom of the body as sort of just a good place for them to go for now. So in this class, that's where we'll tend to be putting these script tags. And then the way you can sort of imagine this happening is that the HTML content is going to say, great, I've got my inside my body. I'm going to render my H1. I'm going to render a paragraph. And then I'm going to render the script, by which I mean the browser will go to that script file and it will execute that script. It will run that code top to bottom. It will go make that thing happen. All right, so we do that. We save our work. So we've now included our script inside of our index.html. We go back to our page. If we hit refresh, you'll notice that we're still not seeing the HTML, the hello world file yet. In order to see stuff like console.logs, we actually have to see that inside the developer tools. So the console, the web console, the thing that we're actually printing stuff out to isn't the browser page itself, right? This isn't a console. This is the HTML. This is the browser content itself. So we can see this console, whatever we've logged to it, we can see that output by going into our developer tools. So again, if we go to View, Developer, we can open up the developer tools sort of as a whole. And if you go to the console tab, we've previously been looking at the elements tab, right? That's where we've looked at things like the HTML and our CSS. If we go to our console tab here, we can see the web console, the hello world content that we said we want to log. Now, importantly, this means that any messages that you output with console.log are developer level only, right? They're only visible to developers, people who know to go open up those tools. That you can't use them to share information with the user. So for example, if you're trying to build out some application and you want to let the user know there was an error or let them know some message, you can't use console log to do that. We'll have to use other methods of putting that content on the screen, which we will go through in a future video. So at this point, we've now got our index, our HTML file. We're able to load our JavaScript, and we'll be able to console log hello world inside of our developer console. Great. Okay. So the way that JavaScript scripts are written and they're structured is they're going to look a lot like R scripts or a lot like Python scripts. There's no single main method like you might have in Java. Instead, what's going to happen is that every single line of code we write, when we get to say run this script tag, that script tag is going to be executed top to bottom. It'll just go ahead and run each of those lines of code one after another. So if we said do the console log hello world, if we then said console log this is JavaScript, spelled correctly, then when we go back to our browser, and again we're going to refresh our page, so we're going to say load the content, which means rerun the script, right? It won't just happen automatically. When I refresh my browser, we then get our first line of code, hello world. Our second line of code, this is JavaScript. We've printed out our multiple pieces. Note that the developer tools will tell you where those things come from. So this says this comes from index line 3, this comes from line 4. So you can actually use that for debugging to figure out where these elements came from. Cool. I'll also note that the developer console here is where we'll see things like errors, right? If we do something incorrect. So if we, for example, try to explicitly forget our parentheses on our function and we try running our code, this is where you'll see things like syntax errors or content errors or other kinds of errors. And again, it'll say uncaught error. It shows up in a big red box telling you there's a problem. And then it'll tell you what the problem is. This is a syntax error that found an unexpected string at line 4, character 13. And we know it's unexpected because there should be a set of parentheses in here because it's a function. And again, we refresh that. So what this really means then is that whenever you're doing JavaScript coding, you need to have the developer tools open. Because without that, right, if these developer tools were closed and I had some error in my JavaScript, I tried doing something wrong, from the user's perspective, there's nothing happens. There's no error. It all fails silently from the user's perspective. So as developers, we want to make sure we have the developer tools open all the time so that we can see that output. We can see those kinds of errors. You fixed, get you refreshed. Okay, that's the structure here. So again, when we're writing JavaScript code, we're basically going to be writing inside of generally a single file. For now, we'll add more files later. And we're just writing code top to bottom, running it one after another. The JavaScript syntax overall comes from, it is built on C the same way Java is, so the C programming language, which means it's going to have a lot of similarities to Java. It's going to have a lot of actually similarities to Python in some cases as well. You'll have things where you'll have dot notation, parentheses, semicolons, right? You have foo.bar, you'll have sort of functions and methods. It's going to sort of work conceptually very similar to what you've done in Java, and it'll even be conceptually similar to what you've done in Python. Some of the key differences from Java that we'll go over and again in future videos is that JavaScript is dynamically typed. So we don't declare data types. It's not statically typed. Variables sort of change data. We don't declare variable types. They just work on their own. JavaScript is heavily involved in using objects, and they're not Java style classes and objects. These are JavaScript objects, which are similar, which is a kind of data structure. It's similar to a hash map. And then JavaScript is very heavily utilizes what are called higher order functions, which are sort of ways of having functions sort of have their own special powers and have their own special kind of meanings. And again, we will go through that one in a future video. If you're coming from Python, JavaScript's again going to actually feel in some ways much, much similar in terms of like the actual programming you're doing, the way that you structure logic and the way that you work with some data structures and with some control structures. The main difference from Python is going to be the syntax of those structures. So that, for example, when we're writing control structures for loops, if statements, we're using block style syntax with curly braces, the way that C or Java or R are written, as opposed to using indentation and white space the way that Python is written. So if you're coming from Java, JavaScript's going to feel really similar in terms of the syntax, but sort of the structuring and use of it's going to feel a little weird. If you're coming from Python, the structure and use of it's going to feel super normal. It's just the syntax and the punctuation is going to all look different. So JavaScript kind of sits in the middle between Java and Python in some ways. I'll note that Python also supports higher order functions, just like JavaScript does, but doesn't use them nearly as often or nearly in the same ways that we do in JavaScript. It's going to become a much more important concept for us to work with. So again, that's the basics of getting started in JavaScript. The things to remember are you need to load in your script tag in your HTML. If you try running some JavaScript code and nothing's happening, make sure you've actually included that script. And then in the future videos, we'll actually go through and start learning about how to write some code and what kinds of syntax we write in this JavaScript.